Commander Zephyr's 6 eyes narrowed as she studied the holographic display floating before her. The crimson warning symbols pulsed urgently across the three-dimensional map of the galaxy's outer rim. Each red dot represented a dead star system, consumed by the advancing darkness that her people called the Void Eaters. The War Council chamber aboard the flagship Eternal Vigilance buzzed with nervous energy. Representatives from 12 different species sat around the circular table, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and telepathic hums. They had been fighting this war for over 2 centuries, and they were losing badly. "The quantum calculations are absolute," announced Professor Kilnex, the chief scientist of the crystalline Vorthak race. His translucent body flickered with mathematical equations that appeared and disappeared like lightning. The Void Eaters consume matter at an exponential rate. At current projections, they will reach the galactic core in 47 standard cycles. There is no known technology that can stop them. The room fell silent except for the soft humming of the ship's life support systems. Even the usually boisterous Graxian delegates remained quiet. Their feathered crests drooped in defeat. The Void Eaters were unlike anything the galaxy had ever faced. They weren't just weapons or ships. They were creatures of pure entropy that devoured entire star systems, leaving behind nothing but empty space. Ambassador Thylex of the aquatic nautiloids raised one of her tentacles. "We have tried every weapon in our arsenal. Plasma cannons, antimatter torpedoes, even reality-warping bombs. Nothing even slows them down. They absorb all forms of energy and matter. The mathematical models show 0 probability of success with conventional warfare," added the insectoid hive queen Vazak, her compound eyes reflecting the red warning lights. "Perhaps it is time to consider evacuation protocols for the inner systems." Commander Zephyr's tail lashed in frustration. As leader of the Draconic Imperium's fleet, she had never accepted defeat in any battle. But even she had to acknowledge the cold, hard facts. The Void Eaters had already consumed 30% of the galaxy's outer rim. Billions of civilizations had been reduced to nothing. "What about the humans?" asked a small voice from across the table. Everyone turned to look at Ensign Pollux, a young Centaurian whose horse-like lower body was trembling slightly. His question had been barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the chamber, it rang out clearly. "The humans?" Commander Zephyr's voice carried a note of confusion. "What about them? They're barely a Type 1 civilization. They haven't even achieved faster-than-light travel yet." "Well," Pollux continued, his confidence growing slightly, "they're the only major species we haven't consulted. Every other spacefaring race has contributed to our research and military efforts, but we never contacted Earth because their technology seemed too primitive." Professor Kilnex's body flashed with what could only be described as amusement among his kind. "You want to ask a species that still uses chemical rockets for help against an enemy that has defeated our most advanced civilizations? They can't even leave their own solar system without generation ships." "But they're creative," Pollux insisted. "I've studied their culture extensively. They have this remarkable trait where being told something is impossible only makes them more determined to prove it can be done. They call it human stubbornness, or sometimes spite-driven innovation." The Graxian military attaché ruffled his feathers dismissively. "Stubbornness won't help against beings that exist outside conventional physics." "Their entire history is full of impossible achievements," Pollux pressed on. "They went from first flight to walking on their moon in just 66 years. They split the atom before they had computers. They cure diseases that should be theoretically incurable. There's something different about how their minds work." Commander Zephyr found herself intrigued, despite her skepticism. The humans were indeed an odd species. They had developed nuclear weapons before they developed space travel, which most xenobiologists considered completely backwards. They also had an unusual tendency to anthropomorphize everything, from their machines to their weather patterns. Their psychology is unlike any other sentient species we've encountered, admitted Dr. Whisper, the ethereal psychologist whose translucent form barely registered on most sensors. They have an almost pathological inability to accept limitations, where other species would logically conclude that certain goals are impossible. Humans seem to treat impossibility as merely a challenge to overcome. That's exactly my point, Pollux said, his excitement growing. Every species in this room has looked at the Void Eaters and concluded that defeating them is mathematically impossible, but humans don't think like that. When you tell them something can't be done, they take it personally. The room erupted in a cacophony of different languages and forms of communication. Some delegates thought the idea was ridiculous. Others worried about violating the non-interference protocols that kept primitive civilizations protected from galactic politics. A few seemed genuinely curious about what these strange bipedal mammals might contribute. Commander Zephyr raised her hand for silence. As the senior military officer present, her word carried significant weight. "What exactly are you proposing, Ensign?" "A diplomatic mission to Earth," Pollux replied promptly. "We show them what we're facing, explain the situation, and ask for their help. Not their military, obviously, but their perspective, their way of thinking. Maybe they'll see something we've missed." "You want us to reveal the existence of galactic civilization to a pre-FTL species just to ask them how to fight an unstoppable enemy?" Professor Kilnex's form flashed with disbelief. The cultural shock alone could destroy their entire society. "Or it could save the galaxy," Pollux countered. "We're facing extinction. Normal protocols don't apply anymore." The debate raged for hours. Representatives argued about the Prime Directive, about cultural contamination, about the mathematical impossibility of humans contributing anything meaningful to their cause. But underneath all the logical arguments, there was a growing sense of desperation. They were running out of options. Finally, Commander Zephyr made the decision that would change everything. "We'll send a small diplomatic vessel to Earth. Minimal crew, minimal technology exposure. We'll present the problem as a theoretical exercise and see what they come up with." "Commander, I must protest," Professor Kilnex began. "The protest is noted and overruled," Zephyr replied firmly. "Ensign Pollux, you'll lead the mission. Take Dr. Whisper for psychological consultation and Captain Thorne for security. You have 1 week to make contact and assess their potential." As the council dispersed, most delegates muttering about desperate measures and impossible odds, Commander Zephyr found herself staring at the holographic display again. The red dots seemed to pulse more urgently, as if the Void Eaters could sense their growing desperation. She thought about what Pollux had said about human psychology. Could there really be a species so inherently contrary that they would see the galaxy's greatest threat as just another problem to solve? It seemed impossible. But then again, if Pollux was right about human nature, telling them their help was impossible might be exactly the motivation they needed. 3 days later, the diplomatic vessel Quiet Dawn entered the Sol system, carefully avoiding detection by Earth's primitive radar systems. Ensign Pollux stood on the bridge, watching the blue and green marble that was humanity's homeworld grow larger on the view screen. "Remarkable," Dr. Whisper's ethereal voice echoed through the bridge. "Their planet is teeming with life, but their civilization shows all the signs of a species that developed in complete isolation. No wonder they think so differently." "Beginning scans for suitable contact candidates," reported Lieutenant Hask, the ship's communications officer. "We need individuals with scientific background, security clearance, and psychological stability to handle first contact." "And stubbornness," Pollux added. "Don't forget the stubbornness. That might be the most important qualification of all." As the ship settled into a concealed orbit, Pollux couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to unleash something unpredictable upon the galaxy. Humans had a reputation among xenobiologists for being absolutely impossible to predict or control, but maybe that was exactly what they needed to fight an enemy that had defeated every logical, reasonable, and predictable strategy the galaxy had ever devised. The first phase of humanity's introduction to the wider galaxy was about to begin, and none of them had any idea how dramatically it would change everything. Dr. Sarah Chen was having the strangest Tuesday of her life, and considering she worked at the Theoretical Physics Research Institute at MIT, that was saying something. She sat across from three of the most impossible beings she could have imagined in a conference room that definitely hadn't existed yesterday. The horse centaur thing called itself Pollux and seemed genuinely excited to be there. The translucent floating entity went by Dr. Whisper and spoke directly into her mind, which was deeply unsettling. The third being looked almost human, except for the slight blue tint to his skin, and the way he seemed to analyze everything like it might explode. "So, let me get this straight," Sarah said, leaning back in her chair and trying to process everything they had told her. "You're from a galactic civilization that's been around for millions of years. You've got faster-than-light travel, energy-to-matter conversion, and artificial intelligence so advanced it might as well be magic. And you're here asking a human for help because something is eating your galaxy and all your super technology can't stop it." "That is a remarkably accurate summary," Dr. Whisper's voice echoed in her mind. "Your species has an interesting gift for cutting through complex explanations to reach the core issue." "And this enemy," Sarah continued, "these void eaters, they consume matter and energy at the quantum level. They're basically entropy given form, moving through space and turning everything into nothing." "Correct," Pollux nodded enthusiastically. "Our greatest minds have studied them for 2 centuries. Every mathematical model shows that defeating them is impossible. They adapt to every weapon we use and absorb every form of energy we throw at them." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the holographic images they had shown her. Star systems reduced to empty space, entire civilizations vanishing as if they had never existed. The scale of destruction was beyond anything in human experience. "You know what's funny?" she finally said. Captain Thorne, the blue-skinned security officer, looked confused. "I fail to see anything amusing about galactic extinction." "No, not funny, haha. Funny weird." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the campus where students were going about their normal lives, completely unaware that aliens were sitting in a conference room discussing the end of everything. "You guys are thinking about this all wrong." "How so?" Pollux asked. "You keep talking about these things like they're some kind of unstoppable force of nature, like they're natural disasters or something. But they're not, are they? They're alive." Dr. Whisper's form flickered with what might have been interest. "They appear to be quantum entities that exist partially outside normal space-time. Whether they qualify as alive in any conventional sense is debatable." "Everything's alive," Sarah said flatly. "If it moves, reacts, and adapts, it's alive. And if it's alive, it has needs. It wants things. And anything that wants something can be manipulated, tricked, or exploited." She turned back to face them, and Pollux was surprised to see something in her eyes that he hadn't expected. Not fear or awe at meeting aliens, but excitement. The same look he had seen in human historical records when they faced their greatest challenges. "Tell me more about how they move," Sarah said. "You said they consume star systems, but do they have a pattern? Do they move randomly, or is there a purpose to their path?" Pollux activated a holographic projector, showing a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy with the Void Eater's advance marked in red. "They seem to prefer systems with higher energy output. They consumed the most massive stars first, then moved to smaller ones. But the pattern isn't completely predictable." Sarah studied the display, walking around it and examining it from different angles. "They're not just eating randomly. Look at this progression. They're following quantum field fluctuations in space-time. They're actually surfing gravitational waves between systems. That's impossible, Captain Thorne said immediately. Gravitational waves are far too weak to provide any kind of propulsion, especially for entities of their size. Sarah grinned, and Pollux felt a chill run down his spine. It was the same expression humans wore right before they did something everyone else considered impossible. "Captain Thorne," she said sweetly, "I think you just made a terrible mistake." "What mistake?" "You told a human something was impossible." Dr. Whisper's form brightened with what might have been amusement. "Ensign Pollux warned us about this tendency." "Gravitational waves might be weak by your standards," Sarah continued, "but these things exist partially outside normal space-time, right? That means they can interact with dimensions we can't even perceive. They're probably using gravitational waves as a highway system, amplifying the effects through higher dimensional manipulation." She grabbed a marker and walked to the whiteboard, starting to scribble equations at a speed that made the aliens nervous. If they're surfing gravitational waves, then they're dependent on the wave structure of spacetime itself, and if they're dependent on something, then that something can be disrupted. "Dr. Chen," Pollux said carefully, "our greatest physicists have studied the quantum mechanics involved for decades. The energy requirements alone would require the output of several star systems." Sarah paused in her writing and looked back at him. "How many star systems are they going to consume if you don't stop them?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Pollux realized that from a human perspective, using several star systems to save the entire galaxy was a bargain, not an impossibility. "But even if we could generate that much power," Dr. Whisper pointed out, "we would need to synchronize the disruption across multiple star systems simultaneously. The precision required is beyond our technological capabilities." "That's because you're thinking like civilized people," Sarah replied. Turning back to her equations, "You're trying to build some massive, coordinated device, but humans don't think like that. We think like—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Like engineers trying to fix something with whatever's lying around the garage." She wrote a new equation on the board, then stepped back. "You don't need to build new technology. You need to break the technology you already have." "I beg your pardon?" Captain Thorne looked genuinely confused. "You're faster-than-light drives. They work by manipulating space-time, right? Warping it, folding it, punching holes through it?" "Yes, but FTL drives are precisely calibrated instruments. If you destabilize them, they explode." Sarah's grin got wider. "Exactly." The three aliens stared at her in silence for several seconds. "You want us to deliberately destroy our FTL drives?" Pollux asked slowly. "Not destroy, detonate. There's a difference. If you take a bunch of FTL drives and set them off simultaneously in a coordinated pattern, you could create a massive disruption in the gravitational wave structure of local spacetime, like throwing a rock into a pond, except the pond is reality and the rock is a controlled explosion of warped space." Dr. Whisper's form flickered rapidly. "The cascade effects would be unpredictable. We could accidentally damage or destroy inhabited systems." "How many inhabited systems are left if you do nothing?" Sarah shot back. "Look, I'm not saying it's a good plan. I'm saying it's a plan, and right now you don't have any other options." She walked back to the holographic display, pointing to specific areas. "You set up the detonations here, here, and here. Create a massive gravitational wave interference pattern that disrupts their ability to surf between systems. They get stuck in normal spacetime, where they're vulnerable to conventional weapons." "Even if this worked," Captain Thorne said, "the number of ships we would have to sacrifice would cripple our fleet. We would be defenseless." "You're already defenseless," Sarah pointed out. "At least this way. You're defenseless with a chance instead of defenseless with no chance." Pollux found himself nodding despite his better judgment. There was something infectious about human optimism, even when it was wrapped in what most species would consider insanely dangerous propositions. "There's another problem," he said. "Even if we could convince the Galactic Council to approve such a plan, we would need volunteers to pilot those ships. It would be a suicide mission." Sarah looked at him like he had just said something incredibly naive. "Pollux, you're talking to a species that once strapped themselves to controlled explosions just to see if they could reach the moon. Finding volunteers for a suicide mission to save the galaxy? That's not a problem. That's Tuesday." She walked back to the window, looking out at the campus again. "The real question is whether your people are brave enough to try something that might not work instead of accepting something that definitely won't work." Dr. Whisper's voice carried a note of what sounded like respect. "Your species approaches problems in a fundamentally different way than any other sentient race we have encountered. That's because we're too stupid to know when we should give up," Sarah said cheerfully. "It's probably an evolutionary defect, but it's gotten us pretty far." She turned back to face them, her expression serious for the first time since they had started talking. "Look, I don't know if my idea will work. Maybe it's completely crazy. But I know for certain that sitting around calculating the impossibility of victory won't work. Sometimes you have to try the crazy thing because it's the only thing you haven't tried yet." Pollux activated his communication device, opening a channel to the Eternal Vigilance. "Commander Zephyr, this is Ensign Pollux. We need to talk." "Did you find anything useful?" Zephyr's voice crackled through the device. Pollux looked at Sarah, who was already back at the whiteboard, furiously scribbling new calculations and muttering things like cascading resonance failure and controlled dimensional collapse, with the enthusiasm most people reserved for discussing their hobbies. "Commander," he said carefully, "I think we're about to find out what happens when you tell humans that something is impossible." 6 months later, Captain Marcus Rivera stood on the bridge of the hastily retrofitted human vessel Spite and Malice, watching through the viewport as the largest military fleet in galactic history prepared for what most experts agreed was an elaborate form of suicide. The ship's name had been Sarah's idea. When the Galactic Council had initially rejected her plan as impossibly dangerous and theoretically unsound, she had insisted that any human vessels involved be named appropriately. The Spite and Malice was joined by the Hold My Beer, because we can and technically possible, each one crewed entirely by human volunteers who had enthusiastically signed up for what was officially designated as a high-risk experimental mission with minimal chance of survival. "All human vessels report ready for synchronized detonation," announced Lieutenant Kim Wong from the communications station. Her voice was cheerfully matter-of-fact, as if she were reporting the weather rather than their imminent death. Marcus nodded and opened a channel to the fleet. Around them, ships from dozens of different species hung in space like a vast metal constellation. Draconic Imperium dreadnoughts with their elegant curves and crystal weapon arrays, Graxian carriers that looked like massive feathered birds with wings spread for flight, nautiloid vessels that rippled through space like living creatures of the deep ocean. And scattered throughout the fleet, small clusters of human ships that looked like they had been built in someone's backyard, which in many cases they had been. When word of the mission had reached Earth, volunteers had come from everywhere. Retired engineers, thrill-seeking pilots, college students who thought it sounded totally awesome, and more than a few people who just wanted to be part of the galaxy's most spectacular failure. "This is Captain Rivera aboard the Spite and Malice," Marcus announced to the fleet. "Human contingent is ready to commence what Dr. I Chen has designated as aggressive percussive maintenance on the fabric of reality." Commander Zephyr's voice came through the comm system, tinged with what sounded like admiration and terror in equal measure. "Captain Rivera, are you absolutely certain your people understand what you're about to attempt?" Marcus looked around his bridge. His crew was a mixture of NASA engineers, Air Force pilots, and civilians who had been recruited through what was essentially a help-wanted ad that read, "Seeking individuals for hazardous journey, minimal wages, constant danger, probable death, galaxy-saving glory if successful. The response had been overwhelming. "Commander," he replied, "my people understand perfectly. We're about to blow up our engines in a specific pattern to create artificial gravitational anomalies that will hopefully strand a bunch of entropy monsters in normal space so the rest of you can shoot them. And if it doesn't work, we all die horribly. Did I miss anything, Dr. Chen?" Sarah's voice came through the ship's internal comm system. She was in the engineering section, making final adjustments to what she cheerfully called the most dangerous device ever constructed by human hands. "Don't forget the part where we might accidentally create a black hole and destroy this entire star system." "Right, thank you. And we might accidentally destroy everything anyway. My crew is completely fine with all of this." There was a long pause from Commander Zephyr. "Your species is absolutely terrifying." "We prefer charmingly reckless," Marcus replied. "Dr. Chen, how are we looking?" "All systems are go for what I'm officially calling Operation, because screw physics, that's why," Sarah announced. "FTL drives are rigged for synchronized overload. Gravitational wave detectors are showing the Void Eaters approaching exactly where we predicted, and I've got a whole bunch of equations that are either brilliant or completely insane." "Any way to tell which?" asked Lieutenant Wong. "We'll find out in about 3 minutes." The tactical display showed the approaching enemy. The Void Eaters didn't register on most sensors as distinct objects. Instead, they appeared as areas where space itself seemed to be less. Regions where stars simply stopped existing, where matter and energy vanished into something that wasn't quite nothingness, but wasn't quite anything else either. "All non-human vessels, this is Commander Zephyr. Fall back to minimum safe distance and prepare for engagement once the humans have completed their phase of the operation." Professor Kilnex's voice crackled through the comm system from the flagship. "If this somehow works, it will revolutionize our understanding of physics. If it fails, it will be the most spectacular failure in galactic history." "Win-win situation," Marcus replied cheerfully. "Dr. Chen, final systems check." "Marcus, I want you to know that by every law of physics I understand, what we're about to do should be impossible." "Dr. Chen?" "Yes? You do realize you just told a ship full of humans that something is impossible, right?" There was a moment of silence. Then Sarah's laughter echoed through the ship. "Oh, right. I forgot who I was talking to. In that case, let's go prove physics wrong." The countdown began. Around the fleet, alien crews watched in fascination and horror as the human vessels moved into position. They had calculated the pattern dozens of times, but they were still essentially guessing about how reality would respond to being deliberately broken in 12 places simultaneously. 10 seconds to detonation," Sarah announced. "All human vessels prepare to make physics very angry." Marcus looked around his bridge one last time. His crew was grinning with the kind of expression humans got when they were about to do something magnificently stupid. It was the same expression their ancestors had worn when they decided to climb mountains because they were there, or sail into unknown oceans just to see what was on the other side. 3, 2, 1, mark. 12 human ships detonated their FTL drives simultaneously. Reality hiccuped. The effect was visible across the electromagnetic spectrum as space itself seemed to stutter and glitch like a broken video feed. Gravitational waves crashed through the region like tsunamis, creating interference patterns that human mathematics had predicted and alien physics had declared impossible. For a moment that lasted either microseconds or eternity, depending on which dimension you were observing from, the fabric of space-time developed what could only be described as wrinkles. The Void Eaters, caught in the middle of their extra-dimensional surfing, suddenly found themselves dumped unceremoniously into normal space. For the first time in the war, they were solid, detectable, and most importantly, vulnerable. "All vessels, this is Commander Zephyr. Open fire. Repeat, all vessels open fire." The Galactic Fleet unleashed everything they had. Plasma cannons that had been useless against the Void Eaters suddenly tore through their now physical forms. Antimatter torpedoes that had previously been absorbed without effect now created massive explosions that sent chunks of enemy matter spinning through space. On the bridge of the Spite and Malice, which had somehow survived the detonation of its own engine, thanks to what Sarah insisted on calling aggressive engineering, Marcus watched the battle unfold. "Well, Dr. Chen," he said into the comm, "looks like your crazy plan worked." "I'm as surprised as anyone," Sarah replied. "According to my calculations, we had about a 15% chance of success, a 60% chance of complete failure, and a 25% chance of accidentally inventing time travel." "What happened to the other 25%? "We accidentally invented time travel." Marcus was about to ask what she meant by that, when Lieutenant Wong interrupted. "Captain, we're getting temporal readings from the detonation site. Time appears to be flowing at different rates in various locations." "Is that bad?" "Unknown, sir. But one of the Void Eaters just aged backwards and turned into what appears to be a very confused baby version of itself." Marcus decided he didn't want to know. "Dr. Chen, please tell me you have a plan for cleaning up the temporal anomalies." "Working on it. I figure if we can break physics once, we can probably fix it too. How hard could it be?" On the flagship Eternal Vigilance, Commander Zephyr watched the battle turn in their favor for the first time in 2 centuries. The Void Eaters, stripped of their extra-dimensional abilities, were being systematically destroyed by weapons that had previously been useless against them. "Ensign Pollux," she called across the bridge, "remind me never to doubt human capabilities again." "Yes, Commander. Should I also make a note to never tell them something is impossible?" "That might be wise. At this rate, they might try to fix the temporal anomalies by traveling back in time to prevent themselves from creating them in the first place." On the Spite and Malice, Sarah was indeed working on exactly that solution. 3 hours later, the last of the Void Eaters had been destroyed, time was flowing normally again, mostly, and the Galactic Fleet was trying to process what they had just witnessed. A species that had barely achieved space travel had just solved a problem that had stumped the galaxy's greatest minds for centuries, using a plan that consisted essentially of blow things up in a specific pattern and see what happens. Marcus stood on the bridge, looking out at the debris field that had once been an unstoppable threat to all life in the galaxy. His ship's engines were completely destroyed. They had accidentally created and then fixed several temporal paradoxes, and 3 of their crew members had briefly existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It had been, he decided, a pretty good Tuesday. "Dr. Chen," he called to engineering, "what's our status?" "Well, we're alive. The galaxy is saved, and I think I might have accidentally figured out how to build a faster-than-light drive that doesn't explode when you look at it funny. Also, Lieutenant Johnson appears to have gained the ability to see 17 minutes into the future, but we're calling that a feature, not a bug." Marcus nodded, as if this was perfectly normal. In his experience, working with humans usually led to results that were either completely disastrous or impossibly successful, with very little middle ground. "Commander Zephyr, this is Captain Rivera. Mission accomplished. The galaxy is now safe from extinction, and we only had to break the laws of physics a little bit to do it." "Captain Rivera," Zephyr's voice carried a note of profound respect. "On behalf of every living being in the galaxy, I thank you. Your species has just saved us all." "No problem," Marcus replied. "That's what humans do. We solve impossible problems, usually by doing something everyone else says can't be done. It's kind of our thing." He paused, looking around at his crew, all of whom were grinning with the satisfaction of a job well done and the slightly manic expression of people who had just survived something that should have killed them. "Though I do have one question, Commander." "What's that, Captain?" "Got any other impossible problems that need solving?" because we're just getting started." The laughter that echoed across the comm channels came from dozens of different species, but it carried the same message. The galaxy had just learned what happened when you told humans something couldn't be done, and they had a feeling they were going to be seeing a lot more impossible solutions in the future.